Welcome, dear listener. Before we begin our long journey into the world of Homo erectus, let me ask you a simple question. What time did you sleep last night? Was it early and gentle, or did you find yourself drifting far past midnight? You can share your answer in the comments below. I always enjoy knowing how many fellow night owls or early dreamers are here with me. This channel is a place for rest, for story, and for the kind of quiet knowledge that helps you drift peacefully into sleep. If you enjoy these kinds of long, calm journeys through history and myth, I invite you to subscribe and join our growing circle of listeners. Your support helps keep these stories alive and flowing night after night. Tonight, we step back nearly 2 million years to walk beside Homo erectus, the ancient humans who first mastered fire, shaped stone, and wandered farther than any before them. This is not just history, it is the beginning of our story, yours and mine. So find a comfortable place, let your body settle, and allow your mind to wander. Together we will follow their footsteps into the past, where the first sparks of humanity were born. The story of humankind is not a tale that begins suddenly, nor is it a line that can be drawn neatly across the dust of time. It is more like a river that swells from many streams, each joining the current until the water becomes strong enough to carve the land. In the earliest days of our kind, long before we called ourselves human, there were others who walked upright beneath the sun. Among them, one figure began to rise taller, stronger, and more enduring than those who came before. This was Homo erectus, the upright human, and though their voices are gone, the earth still remembers the sound of their footsteps. The world they inherited was both harsh and generous. Africa, the cradle of their beginning, was alive with grassland stretching wide under skies heavy with light. Herds of antelope and zebra moved like flowing tides, and great beasts, elephants and rhinoceroses, trod the ground so firmly that the soil held their prints for days. Lions crouched in tall grasses, crocodiles basked in sunlit rivers, and vultures wheeled above the air, waiting for the scent of death. For a creature who wished to endure, every breath was a gamble, every step a choice between danger and survival. Yet Homo erectus endured, and in their endurance began the story of what it means to be human. Their rise was not sudden. They had ancestors, beings who walked before them, half shadow and half light of what would later be. There had been Homo habilis, known for their simple tools, and before them Australopithecines, who still clung partly to the trees. But something in the upright humans was different, something that carried them beyond the limits of their kin. Their bodies grew taller, their legs straighter, their strides longer. Their hands, freed from the full demands of climbing, shaped stones into sharper edges. Their minds, though not yet like ours, were beginning to grasp patterns, to see that the world could be bent just enough to favor survival. Imagine one of them standing at the edge of the grassland. The sun burns low in the sky, shadows long, the air heavy with the scent of dust and animals. Her body is lean, strong, covered in hair, but not fur, her skin toughened by the sun. She squints into the distance, seeing the movement of antelope far away. Hunger stirs in her stomach, but she does not move recklessly. She knows the land is also watched by predators. Behind her, her group waits. They are not many, perhaps 10 or 20, bound not by language as we know it, but by shared glances, gestures, and the rhythm of living together. They wait for her signal, for some sign of where to move next. This is life in its earliest form of community, not yet bound by words, but already bound by trust. The world was their teacher. Every sound, every shadow carried meaning. The snap of a twig in the distance could be lion or wind. The sudden silence of birds might mean danger prowling near. Rain clouds gathering meant rivers swelling, fish to be caught, and roots loosened from the soil. In this way, Homo erectus learned to read the land, not in symbols or letters, but in the living pulse of the earth itself. And slowly, step by step, they became masters of it. One of their greatest strengths was movement. Unlike the animals they hunted or feared, Homo erectus was built not for speed, but for distance. Their long legs, their strong tendons, their ability to sweat and cool their bodies in the heat of the day, these gave them endurance unlike any other. While antelope could outrun them in a burst, and lions could chase faster, few creatures could match the upright humans in persistence. They could walk and trot for hours under the sun, following a wounded animal until it collapsed from exhaustion. This was persistence hunting, and it was one of the first signs that the story of survival was shifting in their favor. Stone was another gift. Not the stone itself, but the imagination to shape it. Earlier beings had struck rocks together and found sharp flakes, but Homo erectus took this further. They learned to craft hand axes, tools with edges that could cut through flesh, break open bones for marrow, slice hides for covering. These axes were heavy and simple by our standards, but they were revolutionary for their time. With stone in hand, they became more than scavengers. They could defend, they could butcher, they could transform the remains of a kill into food and shelter. Stone was the first extension of their will, the first true sign that their minds were reaching beyond instinct. But it was not only stone that changed them. It was fire. At first, fire was a mystery. It came with lightning, it roared in the grasslands, it terrified with its heat and smoke. Many animals fled from it, but Homo erectus lingered at the edges. They felt its warmth in the cold night, saw its glow pushing back the darkness. Slowly, they began to tame it, carrying embers, feeding them with dry sticks, guarding them from wind and rain. With fire came a revolution. It cooked their food, softening meat and roots so their bodies grew stronger. It gave them light in the night, a circle of safety where predators hesitated to cross. It bound the group together, for around the flames they shared warmth, they shared safety, and perhaps in some early form they began to share thought. Yet, even with fire and stone, life was never easy. Death was always close, whether in the jaws of a predator, the strike of disease, or the accident of a hunt gone wrong. Infants were fragile, and many did not survive. The group could not afford weakness, yet they also showed signs of care. Fossil evidence tells us of individuals who lived long despite injuries, bones healed though the body was crippled. This meant that others had helped them survive. There was cooperation, compassion even, the beginnings of what would one day become human society. Time in their world was not counted as we count it. Generations passed like the rising and falling of the sun. They did not measure years, but they knew the seasons, the rains that returned, the migrations of animals that moved like clockwork across the grass. In their memory, places became known. A certain tree, a bend in the river, a cave that gave shelter. These were not named, but they were remembered. Knowledge passed not by words, but by presence, by the act of moving together across familiar lands. And then, one day, curiosity carried them beyond the familiar. Homo erectus was not bound to a single place. They had the strength to walk, the patience to follow rivers, the courage to enter new lands. From Africa, they began to spread. Some went east, crossing lands that are now deserts, mountains, and seas. Fossils of their bones and tools have been found far away, in the islands of Indonesia, in the valleys of China, in the lands that would one day be Europe. They became wanderers not because they sought conquest, but because their lives depended on it. To follow the herds, to find water, to escape drought or famine, they moved, and in moving they became the first true travellers of our lineage. But in these earliest days, the beginning of their journey, the story was still raw. The upright humans were learning, testing, adapting. They were shaping not only stones, but themselves. Their brains, larger than those before, were slowly expanding across generations. Their hands were becoming more skilled, their eyes sharper, their sense of cooperation deeper. They stood on the edge of what would one day be called humanity, though they themselves knew nothing of it. The dawn of Homo erectus was not marked by a single moment. It was a long, slow unfurling of potential, a gathering of traits that together formed a being unlike any the earth had yet seen. They were still prey as much as predator, still fragile against the powers of the world. Yet they had something more enduring than tooth or claw. They had resilience. They had curiosity. They had the beginnings of thought that would one day reach beyond the earth itself. As the sun rose and set over the grasslands, their story continued, carried not in words, but in the steady rhythm of their footsteps, in the glow of fires burning against the night, in the quiet bond of groups who survived together. It was the first act in a tale that would span millions of years, a tale that leads, eventually, to us. And so the dawn of Homo erectus shines not only as the start of their story, but as the first true light of our own. The savanna was the classroom where Homo erectus grew wise, though they had no words to name wisdom. Every blade of grass, every shifting shadow, every call of a bird in the distance carried lessons. To live in such a place was to be constantly alert, not in fear, but in an awareness that never truly rested. The upright humans were not kings of their world. They were not yet masters of nature. They were one thread woven among many, yet with each generation they were pulling themselves tighter into the fabric of survival. Life was a cycle of hunger and finding ways to ease it. Food was not always certain, and the savanna did not offer its gifts easily. There were berries and fruits when the season was kind, roots hidden deep in the soil, nuts to be cracked, and insects that wriggled beneath stones. But what truly changed them was meat. At first, they scavenged. A lion would make a kill, tearing into the belly of an antelope, and when the pride had eaten its fill and wandered away, Homo erectus would creep forward. They would wait until the vultures had circled and descended, until the hyenas had taken what they could, and then, with sharp stones in hand, the upright humans would take what remained. They prized the marrow locked inside bones, rich with fat and energy. They learned to crack bones with stone hammers, to use flakes like knives, and to carry away what they could before danger returned. But scavenging was not always enough. Hunger is a teacher that demands boldness. Slowly, across generations, Homo erectus became hunters. Not hunters in the way of leopards or lions which leapt and struck with speed, but hunters of endurance, hunters of patience. They would track an animal across the savanna, moving steadily, not letting it rest, driving it forward under the relentless sun. The upright humans could sweat to cool themselves, while many animals could not. So, step by step, hour by hour, they wore their prey down. When the antelope finally stumbled, exhausted, the group was ready, stone axes in hand. This was persistence hunting, one of the first great strategies that belonged uniquely to them. Their hunts were not silent battles fought alone. They moved as groups bound together by signs and gestures, by looks and shared rhythm. There were no words yet, no sentences to describe a plan, but there were glances, points of fingers, movements of arms. A raised hand might signal stop, a low grunt might mean danger, a steady trot might keep the group in pace. Slowly, across the endless cycles of time, this grew into something deeper, the roots of communication. Not language as we know it, but a bridge between minds. And through that bridge, cooperation became possible in ways that earlier beings had never mastered. The savanna was not only a place of hunger, it was also a place of threat. Lions crouched unseen in the grass, leopards waited in the trees, crocodiles lurked in the river shallows, even snakes could strike without warning. To survive, Homo erectus had to become watchful in every direction. They learned to read the air, to notice when the birds went silent, to listen for the distant cough of a predator. Their eyes were sharp, not only in daylight, but in dusk, when shadows blended and danger was closest. And when the night fell, fire became their shield. Around the flames they gathered, and though their thoughts were not yet wrapped in words, the circle of light became a symbol of safety. Family was the anchor of their lives. Groups were small, never so large that the land could not feed them, but never so small that they could not defend themselves. Perhaps 10, 20, sometimes 30 moved together, bound by blood or by the closeness of survival. Mothers carried infants against their bodies, nursing them until they were strong enough to walk. Older children learned by watching, imitating the movements of their elders, how to crack a nut, how to sharpen a stone, how to watch the sky for signs of rain. The old, if they survived long enough to grow weak, still held value. They carried memory in their bodies, memory of where the water lay hidden in the dry season, memory of which fruits were safe and which poisoned. Their knowledge was not spoken but lived, and through them the group carried its wisdom forward. Everyday life was a rhythm, simple yet relentless. At dawn they moved to water, careful of crocodiles lurking in the shallows. They drank, filling themselves for the day ahead. Then they spread out, foraging, seeking fruits, roots, insects, small animals. Some days were generous, the land offering more than enough. Other days were lean, and the group pressed on with empty stomachs. By evening, they gathered again, sharing what was found. Around the fire, they sat, gnawing on bones, cracking marrow, chewing roots softened by heat. Sparks rose into the night, and the firelight glowed on their faces. Perhaps in those moments, the first seeds of story were planted. Not stories in words, but memories shared in gesture, in mimicry, in sounds that carried meaning. Weather shaped their lives as much as hunger did. The rains came in season, filling rivers, painting the land green. Herds returned, animals fat with grass, and for a time life grew easier. But then came the dry, when the sun beat down and the ground cracked open. Rivers shrank into muddy pools, animals moved farther, and the upright humans had to follow. Thirst drove them, hunger drove them, and yet they endured. Their endurance was their strength. Where others fell, they walked on. Where others sought only shelter, they sought paths across the open land. In this way, slowly, they became wanderers of vast distances. Though they were strong, they were not without fragility. Disease could sweep through a group, and without medicine, the weak often perished. Injuries from falls, from fights, from hunts could cripple or kill. Infants were lost often, their small bodies unable to withstand the world's harshness. And yet fossils tell us that some lived long, despite broken bones or illnesses. This meant others had cared for them, had shared food, had protected them. Compassion, in its earliest form, was alive among them. They were not solitary creatures, not beasts who turned away from the weak. They carried one another, and in that carrying was the spark of what would later be called humanity. The tools they made grew slowly more refined. At first, stones were crude, flakes sharp but irregular. Over time, they learned to strike with greater skill, shaping symmetrical axes, sharper edges, more reliable tools. Each stone carried within it the memory of hands that had shaped it, and from one generation to the next, the skill was passed on. A child would watch, then imitate, clumsily at first, until practice carved skill into their muscles. In this way, knowledge lived not only in memory, but in craft. Life on the savanna was not a tale of constant triumph. For every hunt that ended in meat, another ended in empty hands and tired legs. For every fire that kept predators away, there were nights when storms quenched the flames, leaving the group vulnerable in the dark. Yet survival itself was victory. Each sunrise that found them still alive was proof of endurance, and with each sunrise the story of Homo erectus stretched a little farther. Over thousands upon thousands of years, the savanna shaped them as much as they shaped it. Their bodies grew leaner, their strides longer, their minds sharper. They became creatures of movement, of fire, of stone, of family. They were no longer just another animal among many. They were becoming something else, something new, though they themselves did not know it. And so the days turned to years, and the years to generations. Fires burned, stones were shaped, prey was hunted, water was found, children were born, and elders passed. This was the rhythm of life on the savanna, and it carried them forward into the vastness of time. It was here, under the sun and stars of Africa, that Homo erectus found its strength, its resilience, and its place in the long, unfolding story of humanity. The savanna was a world of constant challenge, but in its trials, Homo erectus discovered two forces that would shape not only their lives, but the future of all humanity: fire and stone. These were not gifts freely given, they were powers wrestled from the earth with patience, courage, and imagination. In their hands, stone became more than rock, and fire became more than flame. Together they marked the slow turning of survival into mastery, the dawn of control over forces far greater than the body alone. Stone was the first. Long before fire was tamed, stone had already begun to change them. At first it was chance. A rock struck against another, and a sharp flake broke free. That edge could cut, could pierce, could scrape. Where fingernails failed and teeth dulled, the stone edge bit cleanly. Flesh could be sliced from bone, hides stripped from carcasses, wood shaved into points. The upright humans began to look at stone not only as something to step over, but as something that could be shaped. Slowly, across thousands of years, this recognition deepened into skill. The Acheulean hand axe became their signature. At first glance it was simple, an oval stone chipped to a point, sharp on both sides, fitting neatly in the hand. But in its simplicity lay brilliance. It could cut meat, crack bone, dig roots, chop wood. It was a universal tool, a Swiss army knife of the early world. Making one was not easy. It required striking stone at just the right angle, with just the right force, again and again, until symmetry emerged. Too soft to strike and the flake would not split, too hard and the core would shatter. This demanded more than strength. It demanded foresight, patience, and an understanding of cause and effect. Each hand axe was more than a tool. It was evidence of thought, of planning beyond the moment. The knowledge of stone was passed not by words, but by sight and imitation. Young ones watched the elders, saw the rhythm of their strikes, the way they turned the rock, the way they shaped edge after edge. At first, the children struck poorly and clumsy and careless, but over time, repetition carved understanding into their hands. Stonecraft was not only survival, it was inheritance, one of the first technologies passed from one generation to the next. And with every hand axe shaped, the line between instinct and learning grew sharper. Stone also gave them confidence. With sharp edges they could butcher large animals quickly before predators returned. They could defend themselves, at least for a moment, against threats. A lion might still overpower them, but with stones in hand, the upright humans were no longer helpless. They carried their edges like extensions of their own bodies, as if the rock itself had become part of their flesh. This was the beginning of technology, and though crude, it was the foundation on which everything else would one day stand. Stone was the first revolution, fire was the second, and perhaps the greater. Fire was unlike anything else. It was alive in its own way, dancing, crackling, breathing. It could destroy as easily as it could protect. At first, Homo erectus feared it. Wildfires swept across the grasslands after lightning storms, devouring everything in their path. Flames roared higher than trees, smoke darkened the sky, and animals fled in terror. But even in fear, curiosity stirred. At the edges of burnt land they found carcasses cooked by heat, meat softened and easier to chew. They felt the warmth lingering in the ashes, the glow that pressed back the cold. Something in them recognized that this force, if controlled, could be a friend as much as a threat. The taming of fire did not come quickly. It was not a single spark caught by chance, but a slow learning stretched across countless lifetimes. At first, they did not create fire, they captured it. When a wildfire burned, they carried smoldering branches, protecting them from wind, keeping embers alive. They learned to feed the flames with dry wood, to shield them with stones, to keep them burning through the night. Over time, the skill grew sharper. They discovered which woods caught flame best, which grasses smouldered longest, how to coax sparks from friction or stone. Slowly, the mystery turned to mastery. With fire, their world changed. Nights that were once filled with terror became bearable. Predators hesitated at the edge of the glowing circle, eyes shining in the dark but unwilling to cross. The upright humans gathered close, not only for warmth, but for safety. Around the fire, the group became tighter, more bound together. Fire was not only a tool, it was a hearth, the first center of community. It drew them in, made them sit close, made them share space. In its glow, they began to see one another differently, not only as individuals, but as parts of a whole. Cooking was perhaps fire's greatest gift. Raw meat was tough, roots were fibrous, nuts were hard. But over flame, flesh softened, flavors deepened, and nutrients released. Bones roasted made marrow easier to draw out. Roots baked in embers became sweeter, easier to chew. For the first time, the upright humans could unlock more energy from the same food. This extra energy fueled their bodies, their movements, and, over long stretches of time, the growth of their brains. Fire fed their minds as much as their stomachs. Cooking also shortened the time spent chewing. Earlier, hominins had jaws built for grinding raw plants for hours, but with fire, meals became quicker, easier. Their faces began to change. Jaws grew lighter, teeth smaller, skulls reshaped to balance larger brains. The upright humans were being sculpted by fire itself, their very bodies rewritten by the flames they guarded. But beyond the practical, fire touched something deeper. It gave them light. For the first time they could see into the night, see faces across the flames, see gestures clearly in darkness. The stars, once sharp and lonely above them, now had a rival glow below. Perhaps around these fires the seeds of story began to sprout. A gesture, a mimic of the day's hunt, a shared laugh or sound of warning. These became performances in the glow, the beginnings of culture, long before words were shaped. Fire also gave them time. Without flame, night, forced retreat, forced stillness, forced silence. With fire, the day lengthened. They could sit awake, safe, hours beyond sunset. They could share, learn, observe. The rhythm of life shifted from dawn to dusk to something larger, something stretched by light of their own making. The upright humans were no longer bound only to the sun. They had made their own sun, one they could carry in their hands. Of course, fire was not without danger. If left untended, it died, and with it safety was lost. If left uncontrolled, it burned too wildly, threatening the very group it protected. Fossils and charcoal layers tell us that they did not always succeed, that sometimes fire consumed more than it gave. But across the millennia, they grew steadier, more skilled, until fire became as natural a part of their lives as stone. Together, fire and stone gave Homo erectus a new identity. They were no longer creatures who simply endured the world as it was. They were shaping it, bending it, turning its raw forces into extensions of themselves. Stone extended the hand, fire extended the night. Stone made them hunters, fire made them gatherers of warmth and light. With these, they stepped farther away from the path of instinct and closer to the path of invention. The changes were slow, stretched across spans of time so vast that no single group could see them. Yet the momentum was steady. Brains grew larger, tools grew finer, fires burned brighter. The upright humans became not just survivors, but innovators. Their lives were still harsh, their deaths often sudden, but within them burned something that no predator carried, no prey possessed. It was not claw, not tooth, not muscle, but imagination. The ability to see a stone not as a rock, but as a tool, to see fire not as a terror, but as a companion. This imagination did not stop with tools and flames. It touched their movements, their migrations, their willingness to walk beyond the horizon in search of what lay further. Fire gave them courage to face cold, to sleep in caves, to endure lands that would have otherwise driven them away. Stone gave them weapons to defend themselves, tools to carve new paths. Together, these forces made them wanderers not only of savannas but of forests, mountains, rivers, and eventually entire continents. And so, in the long stretch of time, fire crackled in more and more places. Smoke rose from valleys and caves, from riverbanks and forests. Stones chipped and flaked, edges gleamed, and the world itself began to bear the marks of their hands. Homo erectus had stepped into a new age, not of words or kingdoms or cities, but of tools and flames. They were still small in number, fragile against the vastness of nature, yet within them glowed the ember of something unbreakable. It was fire that warmed their nights, stone that fed their stomachs, and together they shaped not only the way they lived, but the way they would one day become us. Hunger was the rhythm of their days, a constant drumbeat that guided movement, choice, and survival. For Homo erectus, food was never simply there for the taking. It was earned, step by step, risk by risk, patience by patience. And though plants, roots, and insects filled part of their bellies, it was the pursuit of meat that came to define them. Meat carried energy, strength, and endurance. It was the prize most difficult to win, and the prize that drew them deeper into the identity of hunters. At first, hunting was clumsy. The upright humans had no claws to strike, no fangs to pierce. They were not built for sudden bursts of speed. A lion could overtake prey in seconds, while even the fastest among them could only chase for a short distance. But they carried something no lion or leopard carried: persistence. Their legs, straight and strong, could carry them not for moments, but for hours. Their bodies, cooled by sweat, did not overheat as easily as the antelope or zebra they pursued. Their eyes, sharp with focus, could track movement across long distances, reading prints in the dirt, broken twigs, patterns of flight in the birds. This endurance made them different. Imagine a small group setting out at dawn, the savanna cool under the rising sun. They spot a herd of antelope grazing far in the distance. They do not rush. Instead, they move with patience, closing the gap slowly, keeping their eyes on one target. An animal slightly weaker, slightly slower, perhaps limping from an old wound. The group begins their pursuit, steady and relentless. The antelope bolts, but they follow, not at a sprint, but at a jog, mile after mile. The sun climbs higher. The animal runs again, rests, runs again. But the humans keep coming, driving it forward, giving it no chance to cool its body. Hours pass, and sweat glistens on their skin, but still they move. At last, the animal stumbles, collapses, and the group closes in. Stones flash, hand axes strike, and the hunt is finished. This was persistence hunting, a strategy unlike any other in the animal world. It required not only endurance but cooperation. One hunter could not succeed alone. If one faltered, the others carried on, driving the prey together. It was a communal act, and in that act the bonds between them deepened. Success was shared, as was failure. A kill meant food for all, marrow for the weak, scraps even for the children. It also meant danger for other hunters of the savanna. Lions, hyenas, vultures were drawn by the smell of blood. Quick butchery became essential. With stone axes they stripped meat from bone, filled skins or arms with what they could carry, and retreated to safer ground before scavengers arrived. Hunting shaped not only their stomachs, but their minds. To track an animal across the savanna required memory, focus, and understanding. They read footprints pressed in mud, the bend of grasses where a herd had passed, the faint smell of dung carried on the breeze. They noticed when birds circled above, betraying the movements of animals below. They remembered the places where herds returned season after season, the paths that led to water, the times when the land was most generous. These observations were not accidents. They were lessons carried forward, knowledge stored not in books but in the habits of survival. And slowly across generations, this memory shaped intelligence. The hunt also demanded courage. To bring down a large animal was no small feat. Elephants, rhinoceroses, even giant buffalo roamed their world. To face such beasts with only stone and fire was perilous. Many hunts ended in injury and sometimes death. Yet the upright humans pressed on because hunger pressed harder. Fossil bones tell of injuries healed, fractures that mended, wounds that closed, which suggests the group cared for the wounded, tended to those who could no longer walk. This care was not only kindness, but strategy. A healed hunter could one day return to the chase. In this way, compassion and survival walked hand in hand. Hunting also brought competition. They were not the only ones who sought meat. Lions ruled the savanna with their strength, hyenas with their persistence, leopards with stealth. Crocodiles took their share at the rivers, while vultures and jackals waited for scraps. Sometimes Homo erectus scavenged from these predators, driving them away with fire and stones. At other times, they lost their own kills to the stronger jaws of rivals. Each encounter taught them caution. Each loss sharpened their strategies. Fire became not only a tool of warmth, but a weapon. Torches waving to frighten off intruders. Stones, hurled with precision, became missiles that leveled the balance of power. Slowly, they were learning to stand not as prey, but as competitors in the hierarchy of hunters. The hunt changed their bodies. The need to run, to walk long distances, to carry meat and wood, shaped muscles and bones. Legs grew stronger, spines straighter, feet more suited to the ground. Their lungs expanded, their hearts adapted to endurance. Their bodies became machines of persistence, designed not for sudden power, but for the long struggle. Over time, this physical endurance intertwined with mental endurance, creating beings who could outlast not only their prey, but the challenges of their environment. The social fabric of the hunt wove them closer together. To pursue prey, they had to trust one another, to rely on gestures, signals, and unspoken understanding. One hunter could not risk breaking from the group. Survival depended on rhythm and unity. Around the fire, after the kill, they shared meat, dividing it according to need and strength. This sharing was not only survival but culture. It reinforced bonds, taught fairness, and nurtured cooperation. The young learned by watching, gnawing on scraps while their elders carved with stone. The old, though weaker, still received their share, for their memory of the land remained valuable. The hunt was not only about meat, but about community, about binding individuals into a unit greater than themselves. Seasons marked the rhythm of hunting. In the rains, herds multiplied, fattened by fresh grass, and the hunters thrived. In the dry season, animals thinned, waterholes shrank, and the pursuit grew harder. The upright humans followed the migrations, walking far across the savanna through valleys over rivers. Their feet carved invisible paths across Africa, paths that would one day stretch into continents. Hunting did not root them in one place. It pulled them forward, outward, into new lands. They became wanderers not by choice but by necessity, their stomachs guiding their steps. Though their tools were simple, they were ingenious in their use. Hand axes butchered and cracked, but also dug for roots, shaped wood into spears, scraped hides into coverings. Stones carried long distances became extensions of their will. The act of shaping and using tools demanded foresight, the ability to imagine not only the present, but the future. A stone was not only a rock, it was tomorrow's meal, tomorrow's safety, tomorrow's shelter. This thinking beyond the immediate moment planted the seeds of abstract thought, the very beginnings of imagination. The hunt also carried rituals of its own, though without words or symbols. The gathering before dawn, the steady pace, the gestures exchanged, the shared rush at the end, these were patterns repeated again and again across generations. Such patterns carved themselves into the identity of the group, teaching not only how to hunt, but how to live. Life became a cycle of preparation, pursuit, and sharing, a rhythm as steady as the heartbeat. Predators watched them as they watched predators. In this observation, another layer of learning emerged. By watching lions, they learned the habits of prey. By watching vultures, they learned where carcasses lay. By watching the land itself, they learned survival. This ability to look outward, to gather knowledge not only from their own actions, but from the actions of others, gave them an advantage. They were not simply reacting to the world, they were studying it, shaping responses, adapting strategies. Over countless years, the image of the hunter became inseparable from the image of Homo erectus. They were no longer scavengers lingering at the edge of kills. They were active pursuers, creators of strategy, cooperators bound by trust. They stood as one of the few creatures able to shape the outcome of the chase, not through strength or speed alone, but through patience, endurance, and unity. And yet, even as they hunted, they remained hunted. Lions still struck, leopards still dragged prey into trees, crocodiles still claimed the unwary. Death was never far, but with each generation, the balance shifted. The upright humans, fragile yet resilient, were carving a place for themselves at the table of predators. They were no longer guests, they were becoming permanent. The story of the hunter is not only about the kill, it is about the way the chase reshaped body and mind, the way it bound groups together, the way it planted seeds of thought that would bloom much later. For Homo erectus, the hunt was more than food. It was the foundation of who they were becoming. Endurance taught them patience. Cooperation taught them trust, danger taught them courage, and success taught them that though small in number, though fragile against the vastness of nature, they could carve their survival with stone and sweat. As the fires burned at night, as meat roasted and marrow cracked, the upright humans sat together, stomachs full, bodies weary. The sparks rose into the dark, the circle of light pressing back the unknown. They did not know it, but with each hunt, each shed flame, each day endured, they were writing the story not only of themselves, but of all who would come after. The story of Homo erectus was never meant to stay in one place. From the beginning, they were shaped not only by the land beneath their feet, but by the call of what lay beyond the horizon. Their endurance, their hunger, and their restless movement across the savannas of Africa prepared them for something no other creature of their time achieved. They became wanderers of the earth. Step by step, over generations, they walked out of the cradle of Africa and spread into lands far beyond, carrying fire and stone, carrying memory and instinct, carrying the seeds of the human journey to every corner of the old world. It began slowly, almost without intention. At first, they followed the herds. Animals knew where grass grew greener, where rivers still flowed in the dry season, where the rains returned. The upright humans learned to trust this wisdom. If the antelope moved, so did they. If the elephants marched toward distant valleys, they followed, knowing water would be found. In this way, their movements were guided by the rhythms of other creatures, by the invisible map of survival that stretched across the continent. Over time, these paths lengthened. Droughts forced groups to wander farther in search of water. Fires stripped the land bare, driving them to greener ground. Curiosity tugged them toward the edge of the known, and so, little by little, the boundaries of their world expanded. Rivers became highways of travel, valleys became corridors leading outward, mountains, once barriers, became challenges to cross. Each step outward was not planned as conquest, but lived as necessity. Yet together these steps formed one of the greatest migrations in history. The Rift Valley of East Africa, with its fertile lakes and streams, was a nursery of their kind. From there they walked northward, following the Nile before it was even called Nile, a ribbon of life through desert lands. Others moved eastward, toward the Red Sea and the Arabian Peninsula. From these branches they spilled further, reaching into Asia, into Europe, into islands far from the mainland. The evidence of their bones and tools, scattered across half the world, tells us they did not stop until they had walked farther than any of their ancestors could have imagined. Crossing into new lands was never easy. Each step brought new climates, new dangers, new challenges. The savannas of Africa gave way to deserts, mountains, forests, and coasts. Each landscape demanded adaptation. In dry deserts, they learned to carry water, to dig deeper for roots. In forests, they faced shadows filled with unfamiliar predators and fruits, both nourishing and poisonous. In colder regions, they learned to huddle close to fire, to use hides not only as bedding but as coverings against the chill. They did not conquer these lands quickly, but slowly, across thousands of years, their bodies and minds adjusted, bending to each environment like grass to the wind. Fire carried them forward. Without it, colder lands would have been impossible. Around flames, they survived nights when frost crept across the ground, when winds cut through skin and bone. Fire softened tough plants found in unfamiliar soils, made foreign meats edible, gave courage when the dark felt heavy with new dangers. Everywhere they wandered, they carried embers, protecting them like treasure, ensuring that the light of survival was never extinguished. Stone also walked with them. Though sources of rock changed across landscapes, the skill to shape it remained. On riverbanks they found smooth pebbles that fractured cleanly. In mountains they struck hard flint against stone, releasing sparks and sharp edges. Tools adapted as environments shifted. Hand axes grew smaller or larger depending on needs, flakes shaped differently for new prey or plants. Wherever they went, the mark of their hands etched itself into the earth. The wanderings were not the journey of a single group, but the unfolding of countless generations. A band of 20 might travel a little farther each year, moving with the herds, seeking water, avoiding rivals. Their children grew up knowing only the new lands they entered. Their grandchildren moved farther still until the memory of their birthplace was gone. And yet, through blood and fire, through tools and endurance, the thread of connection remained unbroken. Africa was always the root, but the branches spread wide. In Asia, they reached the great valleys of what is now China, leaving behind skulls and tools in caves that sheltered them through long winters. In Indonesia, they crossed waters that must have seemed endless, reaching islands like Java, where their bones would rest for hundreds of thousands of years. In Europe, they entered lands colder than any they had known, facing ice and snow, finding ways to live where even animals struggled to endure. These were not short journeys. They were odysseys, measured not in lifetimes but in millennia, yet they marked Homo erectus as the first true travelers of the human line. Wandering changed them. Each new land carried lessons written, not in words, but in survival. To move into forests meant learning new foods, listening for new predators. To move into deserts meant learning to endure thirst, to recognize the faint signs of water hidden in dry ground. To move into colder lands meant learning to use fire differently, to guard it against snow, to carry more fuel, to share warmth. Their bodies bore these lessons. Those in colder climates grew stockier, conserving heat. Those in tropical regions grew lean, shedding it more easily. The species was one, yet diverse, shaped by the vastness of the world it now occupied. Wandering also brought encounters, not only with new animals, but with other humans, or almost humans. In their migrations, Homo erectus likely crossed paths with other hominin species, some older, some emerging. The details are lost to time, but bones and tools suggest that the earth was once home to many kinds of humans, each carving their own path. Sometimes they may have competed for food and land. Other times they may have learned from one another, even mingled. The world was not yet ruled by a single lineage, but shared by many, a tapestry of cousins scattered across continents. The act of wandering itself demanded imagination. To step beyond the known required not only endurance, but a willingness to face uncertainty. Each horizon carried both promise and danger. A valley might hold water or might hold none. A forest might shelter fruits or predators. To walk into the unknown required trust in memory, trust in one another, trust in the simple fact that survival lay somewhere ahead. This trust became part of them, a quiet resilience that allowed them to endure where others might have stayed behind. And so slowly their footprints multiplied. Across Africa, across Asia, across Europe, across islands, they left traces of themselves. Stones chipped by their hands still lie buried in soil. Ashes from their fires remain layered in caves. Bones of their bodies rest beneath layers of earth, silent witnesses to journeys that stretched farther than any creature of their time. They did not know it, but they were weaving the first global story of humanity. Wandering was not without loss. Many groups vanished, swallowed by harsh climates, by famine, by predators. Not every step forward led to survival, but enough endured that the species as a whole continued, spreading farther, adapting more, leaving behind pieces of themselves in every land they touched. Each extinction was balanced by survival elsewhere, each loss by endurance. This was the way of their world, not permanence, but persistence. To wander is to carry not only body, but memory. And though Homo erectus had no words, they carried memory in the paths they walked, in the stones they shaped, in the fires they kept alive. Every ember carried from one camp to the next was a link in the chain of time, a reminder that they were not bound to the ground where they were born, but to the movement that kept them alive. Fire was their constant, stone their companion, endurance their guide. These were the tools not only of survival, but of migration. The journey of Homo erectus did not stop at the edges of Africa. Once their steps carried them into new territories, there was no true boundary left, only landscapes waiting to be crossed. Their lives had been shaped by the rhythm of movement, and now that rhythm carried them into the heart of Asia, into the forests and valleys of Europe, into places so different from their birthplace that survival demanded both resilience and imagination. They did not know they were charting the world, but with each generation, with each fire lit in new soil, they claimed it as home. Asia became their great canvas. From the Middle East they spread into the vast plains of India, into the highlands of Central Asia, into the river valleys of China. Fossils and tools tell us their presence was wide, scattered across enormous distances. In China, their remains would be found in caves like Zhoukoudian, where skulls and fire-scorched bones still whisper of their lives. In Indonesia, on the island of Java, their bones would rest beneath layers of volcanic earth. Each site is a pin on the vast map of their travels, proof that they did not linger only at the edges, but reached deep into the heart of the continent. The lands they entered were not always welcoming. Africa had given them warmth and open plains. Asia gave them forests thick with shadows, mountains cloaked in snow, rivers that swelled with monsoon rains. The creatures were different too. Tigers lurked in the forests, bears in the caves, crocodiles in the rivers. Mammoths and rhinoceroses roamed the plains, immense and dangerous. To live here, Homo erectus had to adjust not only their tools, but their entire way of life. In colder regions, fire became more than a comfort, it became survival itself. Flames meant the difference between life and death on nights when temperatures plunged. Gathering wood became as important as gathering food. Fire was no longer something to be kindled only at dusk, but something to be guarded at all hours, tended with vigilance, kept alive like the heartbeat of the group. The knowledge of fire was carried in every journey, each ember carefully protected, each spark coaxed into flame, even when rain fell or snow covered the ground. Tools also shifted with the demands of new lands. In forests, smaller blades were needed to cut wood, to strip branches, to shape spears. In open plains, large hand axes remained useful for butchering game. Stone types changed depending on what the earth provided. Flint, quartz, obsidian, Each held different qualities, and Homo erectus learned them by trial and error, discovering which fractured cleanly, which sparked fire, which dulled too quickly. Their tools were simple by modern standards, but they were born of deep understanding of the materials at hand. Asia taught them patience. To hunt in forests meant listening more carefully, watching for faint movements in the undergrowth, tracking animals not by sight but by sound and broken branches. Rivers became both danger and opportunity. They drowned those who misjudged their currents but provided fish, turtles, and waterfowl to those who learned to wait with stone and patience. Mountains tested their endurance, valleys tested their adaptability. The sheer size of the continent meant no two groups lived exactly the same lives, yet all remained connected by the same fire, the same stone, the same upright stance that carried them forward. Some reached as far as Indonesia, an extraordinary leap across waters that must have seemed endless. Whether by accidental drift on natural rafts of vegetation or by purposeful crossing, they made it, leaving bones in Java that tell us they had arrived nearly 2 million years ago. Once there, they faced volcanoes that reshaped the land, earthquakes that shook their homes, jungles dense with life. Yet still they survived, carrying their story to islands where no creature of their kind had ever set foot before. Europe was another challenge altogether. The continent lay farther north, colder, less forgiving. Winters stretched long and summers were brief. Food could vanish beneath snow. The forests held wolves, bears, and great cats. Yet Homo erectus entered even here, leaving behind tools and bones in places where the cold bit deep. Their bodies, already adapted for endurance, grew stockier in these regions, conserving heat, stronger in frame to face the demands of survival. To live in Europe meant not only enduring cold, but also mastering fire in new ways. Flames had to be shielded from wind and snow. Shelters grew more important, whether caves, overhangs, or simple structures of branches and hides. The ability to create safe spaces became crucial, not just to shield from predators, but from the very climate itself. In these places, the flickering of firelight inside caves must have felt like the heartbeat of survival, a fragile glow against the vastness of the ice. The animals of these lands were both threat and resource. Mammoths roamed, immense and dangerous, yet rich in meat and hide. Woolly rhinoceroses, bison, and giant deer moved across the plains. To hunt them required courage, persistence, and cooperation. Though Homo erectus lacked the weapons of later humans, their endurance and teamwork gave them an advantage. They could follow animals for days, tiring them with relentless pursuit, striking when exhaustion made the kill possible. Even when hunts failed, scavenging from kills left by predators gave them meat, marrow, and survival. Everywhere they went, they left signs of their presence. Caves in China reveal layers of ash, bones charred by fire, tools scattered across stone floors. River valleys in India show hand axes shaped by their hands. Java holds their skulls, thick-browed and strong, silent witnesses to their endurance. Europe holds tools buried in sediments, proof that even in the face of ice and cold, they did not turn back. Their story is not written in words, but in these fragments, scattered like breadcrumbs across continents, leading us back to the truth of their vast journey. The spread across lands was not a single wave, but many. Groups moved, settled, endured, sometimes vanished, sometimes thrived. Climate shifted, forcing them onward or shrinking their numbers. Ice ages came and went, reshaping the world, covering valleys and glaciers, then retreating to open new paths. Each shift tested them, and each time some endured. Their resilience was not absolute, but it was enough. In these wanderings they became more than just survivors of Africa. They became a species of the world, present in so many regions that their absence would have been the true surprise. They did not know maps, but they created them with their feet. They did not know borders, but they crossed them with persistence. Their lives were not ruled by conquest, but by necessity, and necessity carried them farther than any creature like them had ever gone. The sheer time scale of their spread is difficult to grasp. Generations lived and died in valleys, never knowing that their descendants would stand in distant forests, or that cousins would thrive on islands beyond seas. To them, the world was immediate: fire, food, safety, the next step. But from the view of history, their lives stitched together a fabric of migration that covered continents. Across lands they became many things, in some places hunters of the plains, in others fishers of rivers, in others gatherers of forest fruits. Diversity grew not as a choice but as a response to the land, their bodies and tools bent to the earth's demands, until one species carried within it countless variations, all rooted in the same beginning, all linked by the same upright stride. And as they spread, they also left space for others. The world was not empty of humans. Cousins emerged, some from earlier branches, some evolving alongside them. In Europe, other species would rise in time, stronger in the cold. In Asia, others too would appear. Homo erectus was not alone but part of a greater human family, one that would one day splinter into many forms. But in their age they were the first to prove the world itself could be lived in, the first to make vast distances part of their home. Their story across lands is not of conquest or invention, but of endurance, of adaptation, of simple steps repeated until they reached farther than instinct should have allowed. They were not bound by fear of the unknown, but driven by the steady pressure of survival, the quiet pull of what lay beyond. And so across lands they carried themselves forward, into Asia, into Europe, into islands and mountains, rivers and forests. They walked until the world itself seemed smaller, until their presence was woven into the fabric of 3 continents. Their fires burned in caves where snow fell outside. Their tools shaped wood in jungles where humidity pressed heavy. Their bones rested in soils thousands of miles apart. And all of it was part of one continuous story, the story of a species that refused to remain still. They were not yet us, but they carried the first true hints of what we would become. Not because they spoke as we speak or thought as we think, but because they moved as we still move, restless, enduring, reaching outward, never fully satisfied with what lies behind. They were the first to prove that the human journey would never end at the horizon. Water has always been more than a resource. It has been the quiet architect of human life. For Homo erectus, water guided their steps as surely as hunger and fire. Wherever rivers wound through valleys, wherever lakes spread wide under the sun, wherever the sea pressed its edge against the land, they found opportunity. The story of their survival cannot be told only in savannas and forests. It must also be told along riverbanks, at lake shores and on coasts where the horizon seemed endless. Rivers were the first lifelines. They flowed across continents like veins carrying water, food, and pathways. To follow a river meant never straying far from drink, from fish, from animals that gathered at its banks. Herds came to drink, and hunters came to wait. Crocodiles lurked too, and sometimes death was the price of carelessness, but the risk was matched by reward. Along rivers, Homo erectus sharpened their patience. They watched currents, learned where fish lingered, where turtles buried their eggs, where birds nested near reeds. A river was not simply a line of water, but a corridor of life. At the edges of lakes, survival took on a different rhythm. Here the land gave more than food, it gave permanence. Lakes did not wander like herds or dry up with the seasons as easily as small streams. They offered constancy. To live beside them was to live with a steady hand on survival. The remains of Homo erectus in places like Lake Turkana in Africa and later in Asia remind us that lakes were more than background. They were anchors. Families could linger longer here, building camps that lasted more than a few nights. They might not have thought of it as settlement, but it was a step toward rootedness. The coasts opened an even greater horizon. To stand before the sea must have been overwhelming, the expanse of water stretching farther than sight. Yet even here they did not turn away. Shellfish clung to rocks, crabs scuttled in tide pools, fish darted close to shore, seabirds nested on cliffs, their eggs a feast for the bold. To live by the sea was to find abundance in places where few predators followed. The waves carried dangers, but they also carried gifts, driftwood, seaweed, sometimes even the bodies of sea creatures washed ashore. To a hungry band, each offering was opportunity. Along rivers and coasts, tools found new purpose. Sharp flakes could scrape fish, open shells, cut reeds. Spears became more useful near shallow waters where fish could be cornered. Even hands alone could gather clams and crabs from tidal flats. Fire added another layer. Roasting fish made it safer to eat. Boiling shellfish in simple pits made them easier to digest. Though they did not know chemistry, their stomachs told them that cooked food brought strength without sickness. Rivers were also pathways. Following their curves led groups deeper into continents. Valleys carved by rivers opened routes through mountains. Coasts, too, became corridors, guiding groups along shorelines, linking one bay to the next. It was not chance that so many remains of Homo erectus are found near water. These landscapes did not just support life, they directed it. Their migrations were not random scatterings, but steady movements along the blue lines of Earth. The presence of water also shaped their gatherings. Camps near rivers grew larger than those in forests or plains. More families could share a single stretch of shore, each drawing food from the same source without exhausting it quickly. These gatherings allowed for the sharing of fire, of tools, of unspoken knowledge. Around lakes and coasts, groups may have lingered longer together, shaping bonds that stretched beyond immediate families. Such gatherings were fragile, often breaking apart when resources thinned, but they planted the seeds of sociality, the beginnings of larger human communities. Predators knew the value of rivers too. Crocodiles were constant threats, silent beneath the surface. Big cats prowled the banks, waiting for thirsty animals, and sometimes for humans. Even snakes thrived in these places, adding to the dangers. Yet the risks did not push Homo erectus away. They learned caution, teaching their young to approach carefully, to watch for ripples, to listen for silence as much as sound. Danger sharpened their awareness, and awareness became survival. The sea was more than food and risk, it was also mystery. For those who reached Indonesia, the ocean was not a boundary, but a threshold. Crossing to islands required more than luck. Whether swept by storms on natural rafts of vegetation or guided by deliberate movement, they managed it. This crossing changed everything. Islands held creatures unknown on the mainland. Some offered safety, others new dangers. Isolation shaped the groups that settled there, pressing them into new forms of adaptation. The ocean, vast and untamable, became both barrier and bridge, shaping their destiny far from Africa. In China, caves near rivers tell us of long-term habitation. Ashes lie deep in the earth, layer upon layer of fire built across generations. Bones of deer and other animals show what they ate, while shells and fish bones hint at the richness of rivers. These caves were not just shelters but living records, each stratum a page of survival. In them, Homo erectus did not simply pass through but lingered, returning season after season, as though the rivers outside offered a steady invitation. Rivers and coasts also played a role in resilience during harsh climates. When drought struck, rivers shrank but rarely disappeared entirely. When cold deepened, coastal foods remained. Shellfish do not flee the way herds do. Fish may be harder to catch in winter, but they do not vanish. In times when land failed them, water still offered life. This dependence on rivers and coasts may have been one reason Homo erectus endured so long, far longer than many other species. The presence of water also left marks on their minds. To see the constant flow of a river, the endless motion of waves, the rise and fall of tides, it must have left impressions. They may not have named them, but they learned their patterns. They knew when rivers swelled with rain, when fish gathered in pools, when tides left food upon the sand. This attentiveness was not abstract thought, but lived knowledge, as vital as knowing which plant to eat or which animal track to follow. In some places, rivers became more than hunting grounds. They became cemeteries. Bones of Homo erectus have been found washed into ancient riverbeds preserved in sediments. Whether their dead were deliberately placed there or carried by floods, the river became both giver and keeper of life. Water shaped not only their survival, but their memory. The rhythm of rivers and coasts also influenced movement between groups. Shorelines were open highways where visibility stretched far, where groups could see smoke from other fires, where paths crossed more often. Lakeshores, too, became meeting grounds. These encounters were not always peaceful, yet they created opportunities for exchange of mates, of tools, perhaps even of sparks of new ideas. Without such contact, groups risked dwindling, but with it, they carried vitality forward. To live by water was to live with change. Rivers shifted their courses, carving new channels, abandoning old ones. Coasts rose and fell with tides and storms. Lakes dried and refilled with rains. Homo erectus adapted to these rhythms, moving when needed, waiting when patience promised reward. This flexibility became a strength, a quiet resilience that allowed them to endure across ages. Even as they spread inland, the memory of rivers and coasts traveled with them. The skills learned there, patience in waiting, cooperation in fishing, vigilance against hidden danger, were carried into other landscapes. In this way, Water shaped not only their immediate lives, but their broader capacity to survive anywhere. And so, along rivers and coasts, their fires burned. Shadows flickered against cave walls beside rivers in China. Smoke curled above beaches in Indonesia. Ash settled into the soil near lakes in Africa. These fires were not grand beacons, but quiet testaments to persistence. Each flame, each reflection of firelight on water, was a reminder that survival was not a matter of conquest, but of learning to live with the world's rhythms. The rivers flowed on, the seas rose and fell, and Homo erectus remained. They did not master the waters, but they lived with them, shaping their story along every shore, every bank, every tide. And in time, their presence along rivers and coasts would teach their descendants, our ancestors, that the world's edges were not limits, but invitations. For countless generations, Homo erectus had been alone in their world, the only kind of human to walk the plains, to gather at rivers, to stare into the fire at night. But the earth does not remain still, and evolution never pauses. In time they were no longer alone. Other humans began to appear, shaped by different lands, carrying their own strengths. The story of Homo erectus from this point is not just a story of survival against nature, but also survival alongside others who were both kin and rivals. The first encounters were not sudden. They unfolded across centuries, slow movements of groups into overlapping territories. In Africa, new forms of humans began to emerge, more slender, with larger brains, with finer tools. These were the early ancestors of what would later become Homo sapiens. In Europe, heavy-browed humans, who would one day be called Neanderthals, developed their own ways of life. In Asia, other unique groups arose, some of them distinct enough to leave traces in our DNA even today. For Homo erectus, meeting them was not like meeting strangers from another world. They were different, but not impossibly so. They walked upright, used fire, shaped tools, hunted, and gathered. They were close enough to be recognized as kin, yet different enough to spark tension. The encounters likely began at the edges, at river crossings, at lake shores, along hunting paths. A band of Homo erectus might come across a group whose fire smelled unfamiliar, whose tools looked different. They would have watched from a distance, cautious, ready to flee or defend. The first response was almost certainly not welcome. Resources were too precious to share freely. The presence of another group meant competition, not comfort. Yet survival demanded more than fear. At times, aggression would have flared. At other times, curiosity might have won. The evidence of these encounters lingers faintly in bones and tools scattered across continents. In some regions, layers of stone artifacts show overlapping use. One group leaving behind hand axes, another leaving more refined blades. At times, both types appear together, as though two worlds brushed close. The question is always the same. Did they meet in peace, in violence, or in some fragile balance between? The truth is likely all three, shifting with circumstances. Competition was unavoidable. Herds could not feed all. Lake shores could not shelter endless camps. When food thinned, encounters turned dangerous. A sudden shout, a thrown stone, a clash with spears. It was not war as we imagine it, but it was conflict. Yet conflict alone does not explain how these groups coexisted for millennia. Something else must have happened too. There must have been moments of tolerance, of uneasy peace, of exchange. For survival is rarely only about fighting. it is also about finding ways to endure together, even if only briefly. In such moments, perhaps fire was shared. Perhaps one group, hungry, approached another and found not hostility but a meal. Perhaps tools were traded, stone from one valley for bone points from another. Perhaps mates were exchanged, bonds formed that linked families across kinds. The genetic record whispers of such unions. The DNA of modern humans carries echoes of encounters with ancient cousins. That story began long before us, in the time when Homo erectus still walked. The presence of other humans also forced adaptation. Where once a group of Homo erectus might have been secure in their hunting, the arrival of rivals demanded sharper skills. They had to become more observant, more flexible, more persistent. Those who adapted survived, those who could not fell behind. Evolution sharpened its edge in these encounters. Imagine a band of Homo erectus moving along a river in Southeast Asia. They find signs of others, different footprints in the mud, a scatter of broken shells, ashes, not from their fire. They pause, uneasy. Do they approach? Do they wait? Night falls, and in the distance another fire glows. The air is thick with tension, but it is also alive with possibility. For the first time, they are confronted not just with the world around them, but with themselves, reflected in others. In some places, coexistence may have stretched for centuries. Territories overlapped, yet neither group pushed the other entirely out. They shared landscapes without truly merging, like parallel streams running close but not joining. In other places, the balance was broken. One group's strength outweighed the others and survival tipped. Bones with marks of violence remind us that not all meetings were peaceful. Some ended in death. Yet even in conflict there was recognition. They were not predators chasing prey. They were rivals chasing the same dream, life. These encounters also left cultural marks. When two groups lived near one another, ideas may have traveled even if bodies did not. The sight of a different tool, sharper or more efficient, could inspire imitation. The use of fire in a new way, the gathering of food from an unfamiliar source, all could spark change. Innovation did not emerge in isolation. It spread along lines of contact, carried by eyes that saw and hands that copied. In this way, encounters became engines of progress, even if neither group intended it. There is a quiet irony in this story. Homo erectus, once the pioneer, the wanderer who first left Africa and spread across continents, became the elder in a world where new humans were rising. They had been the first to master fire, to carve tools of stone with skill, to cross seas to islands. But now they faced others who carried the story forward in new directions. It was not a sudden replacement. It was a long, slow shift, like the changing of seasons. And in this shift, Homo erectus played the role of both teacher and rival. The encounters were not only with humans. Other hominins, like the Denisovans in Asia, left traces that speak of diversity even among ancient people. The world was never home to only one kind of human. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of groups overlapping, competing, sometimes blending. For Homo erectus, this was both challenge and opportunity. To survive among many was harder than to survive alone, but it also meant that their story was woven into a larger human fabric. What did these encounters feel like to them? We can only imagine. Perhaps awe, perhaps fear, perhaps curiosity. To see another being so much like yourself, but not quite the same, must have stirred something deep. It may have been the first time humans felt the sense of us and them. That feeling, born in encounters long ago, has echoed through all human history since. Over time, the balance shifted. The newer humans carried advantages: larger brains, more refined tools, greater ability to adapt. Slowly, in region after region, Homo erectus began to fade. Yet their fading was not disappearance without trace. Through encounters, through exchange, through union, parts of them endured. Their ways of making fire, their persistence in hunting, their courage in crossing landscapes, these lived on in the humans who followed. The encounters were not only about survival, they were also about identity, though they could not name it. In meeting others, Homo erectus came to see themselves as a kind, distinct, yet connected. It was the beginning of a long human awareness, that we are one among many, and that to live in the world is to live not alone, but in relation to others. By the end of their time, Homo erectus had met many of their kin. They had seen other faces in the firelight, other shapes walking along rivers, other shadows moving through forests. They had felt both the sting of conflict and the quiet of uneasy peace. They had lived long enough to know that the world was wide enough for more than one kind of human, even if it was not wide enough for all to endure forever. And so their encounters shaped them just as they shaped us. To meet another is always to be changed, whether by rivalry, by union, or simply by awareness. In this way, the story of Homo erectus is not only the story of a species, but of the first steps toward humanity's broader identity. They were not the last, but they were among the first to learn what it means to live in a world of many kinds of humans, each carrying the same hunger, the same fire, the same fragile hope to endure. The story of Homo erectus had stretched across nearly 2 million years, longer than any humankind before or since. They had endured droughts and floods, forests shrinking to grasslands, ice creeping down from the north and retreating again. They had learned to carry fire, to shape stone, to cross rivers and even seas. They had walked farther than any before them, reaching Africa, Asia, and islands scattered beyond the horizon. But even the most enduring story must eventually change. The last chapters of their time were not written in sudden collapse, but in a slow fading, a dimming light that lingered for many thousands of years before it finally went out. The world they faced in these final ages was not the same as the one their ancestors had entered. New humans had appeared. In Africa, more advanced forms of Homo began to rise, carrying larger brains and more refined skills. These were the early beginnings of Homo sapiens, our own ancestors. In Europe, the Neanderthals had grown strong, well adapted to the cold forests and valleys. In Asia, other unique people lived, the Denisovans, whose presence is still written faintly in our genes. In this mosaic of humankind, Homo erectus was no longer the pioneer, no longer the only walker of the earth. They were one among many, and slowly they became the elder, the one whose time was passing. The changes were not sudden. In some regions, Homo erectus continued much as they had for ages, gathering plants, hunting antelope, sitting around fires at night. For them, life must have seemed stable, the rhythms unchanged. Children were born, grew, and carried on, but around them the world shifted in ways too slow to notice in a single lifetime, yet powerful enough to transform everything across generations. New humans carried tools that were sharper, made from flaked stone, that cut finer edges. They shaped weapons with more care, hunted with more coordination, and adapted faster to shifting climates. Slowly, these differences added weight, tilting the balance of survival. In Southeast Asia, where Homo erectus had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years, their numbers began to thin. Evidence shows that they lingered longest on the island of Java, far to the east, where isolation gave them time. There they continued long after many of their kin had disappeared elsewhere. They lived beside rivers, gathered shellfish, and hunted deer. They endured, generation after generation, while across the seas and continents other humans were changing, advancing, spreading. It was as though Homo erectus had retreated to the edges, holding on where the pressures of competition were gentler. Yet even in these refugees, life grew harder. Climate cycles shifted more rapidly in these later ages. The Earth entered a rhythm of ice ages, long freezes followed by warmer intervals. Animals moved, landscapes changed, and resources became unpredictable. For a species that had thrived through patience and persistence, this new unpredictability tested their resilience. The skills that had carried them so far, endurance in the hunt, steady gathering, simple tools, were no longer always enough. Meanwhile, encounters with other humans were not only moments of contact, but forces of change. In some regions, Neanderthals dominated, pushing others aside. In Africa, the early sapiens grew more numerous, their communities more connected, their adaptability sharper. When these new humans spread into Asia, they brought with them fresh competition for land, food, and water. For Homo erectus, who had long been masters of persistence, it was now persistence against odds increasingly tilted against them. Still, they did not vanish all at once. Their stories stretched on in pockets, echoing through time. On Java, they lived perhaps until as recently as 100,000 years ago, possibly even later. Imagine that, while Neanderthals walked in Europe and early sapiens painted caves in Africa, a group of Homo erectus still sat by fires on a distant island, still shaped their simple tools, still taught their children to track animals. They were echoes of an ancient age, surviving as the world moved into a new one. The last of them may not have known they were the last. To them, life would have seemed much as it always had been, seasons turning, children growing, dangers of predators, the satisfaction of a hunt. But in truth, the net was tightening. Their numbers were too few, their skills no longer enough to match the challenges around them. When they met new humans, they may have sometimes blended, leaving fragments of themselves in the gene pool, but mostly they were absorbed, replaced, or simply outlasted. The decline of Homo erectus was not a story of failure, it was the natural turning of time. For almost 2 million years they had succeeded beyond measure. They had been the first great travelers, the first firekeepers, the first to step beyond Africa's cradle. They had endured longer than any of the humans who came after them, including us, so far. Their fading was not a collapse but a completion, the ending of a chapter after an extraordinary span. Think of the last bands of Homo erectus on Java, perhaps only a few families holding on to familiar valleys and rivers. They would have known every bend of the land, every path of the animals they hunted. They would have carried the stories of their ancestors, not in words as we know them, but in the living knowledge passed from gesture to gesture, from the way a tool was shaped, the way a fire was lit, the way a child was taught to throw a spear. That knowledge was their heritage, their culture, even if it was never written. And in their quiet persistence, they carried the dignity of being among the longest survivors our kind has ever known. When they finally disappeared, it was not with a single event, no catastrophe that erased them. It was a fading, one group dwindling here, another gone there, until at last no more fires were lit by Homo erectus, no more footprints pressed into the mud by their feet. Their absence was gradual, their silence spreading slowly, until only others remained. Yet their echoes did not vanish entirely, for in the tools we still find buried in the earth, in the fossils of their bones, in the whispers of their endurance, they remain part of us. Their last echoes also live in the lessons they left behind. They taught the world that humans could walk farther than any beast, that persistence could overcome even the swiftest prey. They showed that fire could be carried, tended, and made into a companion for survival. They revealed that stone could be shaped into something more than a broken rock, that it could become a knife, a spear, a tool that extended the hand. These lessons did not die with them. They were taken up by others, carried forward into the future. In that way, Homo erectus never truly ended. They simply transformed, their spirit of endurance living on in those who followed. And perhaps in the deepest sense, their greatest legacy is time itself. No other humankind has lasted as long. Their 2 million years are a measure of patience, of adaptation, of resilience. Compared to them, our own species, Homo sapiens, is young, only a few 100,000 years old. Whether we will last as long as they did remains unknown, but their story reminds us that survival is not a sprint. It is a long endurance, a steady persistence across shifting worlds. So the last echoes of Homo erectus fade not as a tragedy, but as a testament. They were the dawn walkers, the firekeepers, the wanderers who first dared to leave home. They lived through ages uncountable, and when their time ended, they left behind a world richer for their presence. Their footprints may no longer press the earth, but the paths they opened still stretch beneath our feet. Every step we take today is across ground they first walked. Every fire we light is kin to the ones they tended. And every breath we take as humans carries the echo of the long endurance they once embodied. In this way, Homo erectus is not gone. They live on in the bones of the earth, in the echoes of our blood, in the very idea of humanity as a journey across time. The last of them may have sat quietly by a river, fire flickering at night, unaware that they were closing one of the greatest chapters of human history. But in that quiet moment, they were part of something vast, a story that still continues. For though they were the last of their kind, they were never alone. Their echoes carry forward, still shaping us, still reminding us who we are and how far we have come. The story of Homo erectus is not only about what they were, but about what they left behind. Their footprints may have faded, their fires long gone cold, but the shape of human history was carved deeply by their hands, their persistence, their courage to walk into the unknown. To speak of their legacy is to speak of us, for without them we would not stand here today. They were not simply a species that lived long ago. They were the bridge between the fragile beginnings of humanity and the rise of the world we now know. Their first and most enduring legacy is survival itself. For nearly 2 million years they endured on a planet that was wild, shifting, often hostile. Few creatures can claim such a span, and no other humankind has lasted as long. Through droughts and floods, through forests turning to savannas and back again, through ice creeping across continents, Homo erectus remained. They adapted when food was scarce, they endured when predators pressed close, they learned when the world changed around them. In their very endurance, they proved that human beings could outlast almost anything. that resilience still lives in us, a quiet strength carried in our blood, in the way our bodies and minds are built to persist, to endure long after others would falter. Their second great legacy lies in their tools. The Herculean hand axes they shaped were more than just stone. They were symbols of foresight, of planning, of creativity. To hold one is to hold a story of intention, of a mind that looked beyond the present moment. They learned to take what nature gave, the rough stone, and carve it into something sharper, something more lasting. These were not random breaks, but deliberate designs passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. In doing so, they created the first traditions of human craft, the first inheritance of knowledge that outlived its maker. Every tool we use today, from the simplest knife to the most complex machine, carries a line that stretches back to those first shaped stones. Fire was another of their gifts. They were among the first to master its power, to gather it from lightning or volcanic sparks, and then to keep it alive, nurturing it like a fragile child. Fire gave them warmth on cold nights, protection from predators, light in the darkness, and the ability to cook food, unlocking new strength for their bodies and minds. Fire also created community, for it drew them together into circles of safety where knowledge was shared and bonds were strengthened. When we light a fire today, whether in a hearth, a camp, or even the spark of electricity, we repeat a ritual begun long ago by Homo erectus. Fire is more than flame. It is continuity, a thread of connection across time. Their migrations were perhaps their boldest legacy. Homo erectus was the first of our kind to leave Africa, to walk beyond the cradle where humanity began and step into lands unknown. They crossed deserts and rivers, mountains and seas. They reached Asia, Europe, and distant islands, spreading farther than any of their ancestors had dreamed. In those journeys, they showed that humans were not bound by borders of land or sky. They proved that curiosity and necessity could carry us across horizons, that we could find ways to live in almost every corner of the world. Today, when we travel across oceans or send machines to distant planets, we are continuing the impulse first lived out by Homo erectus, the drive to see what lies beyond. But their legacy is not only in what they created or where they traveled. It is also in the way they lived, in the patterns of life that shaped the essence of being human. They formed groups, cared for one another, raised children together. Fossil evidence suggests that some injured or elderly individuals lived longer than they might have if left alone, meaning their groups must have shared food, offered protection, and supported those who could not always hunt or gather. In this, we see the roots of compassion, the beginnings of community, as something deeper than survival. It was not only strength and endurance that kept them alive, but also cooperation. That spirit of caring is still one of the most human things about us. As they faded and other humans rose, their direct presence may have ended, but echoes of them remain in ways we are only beginning to understand. Some genetic traces suggest that the story of human evolution is not simple replacement, but a tapestry of mingling, of borrowing, of blending across kinds. While we may not carry much direct DNA from Homo erectus, the very possibility of interaction reminds us that human history is rarely cleanly divided. It is more like rivers meeting, branching, and flowing onward together. Even where their genes did not remain, their influence did. Every later human species built upon what they had begun. Neanderthals refined tools further, sapiens painted caves and built cultures, But the foundation was laid by Erectus. Without their fire, later humans might never have thrived. Without their endurance, the human line might not have survived. Without their first steps out of Africa, the map of humanity might have been far smaller. They were not only part of the chain of ancestry, they were the turning point, the ones who carried humanity from its fragile beginnings into a durable, lasting form. Perhaps their greatest legacy is perspective. To think of Homo erectus is to remember how vast time truly is. We, Homo sapiens, have existed for only a fraction of their span, and yet we already think ourselves eternal. But their story humbles us. It reminds us that survival is not guaranteed, that adaptation is everything, that even the longest living kind can one day fade. If they lasted for 2 million years, will we last as long? Will our fires still burn? Our tools still shape the world? Our communities still endure when millions of years have passed? These questions echo from their memory, asking us to see ourselves not as the final chapter, but as one more part of a story still being written. There is also beauty in knowing that their story is not gone but preserved in the earth itself. Fossils of their bones, tools of their hands, the ash of their fires, all lie waiting beneath soil and stone, telling us fragments of their lives. Each discovery is like hearing their voice across time, a whisper that says, "We were here, we walked this path before you." Archaeologists who hold a hand axe, who trace the shape of a skull, are not just studying bones and stones, they are touching a legacy that still shapes who we are. And so when we think of Homo erectus, we must not think only of what ended, we must think of what continues. They live in every journey we take, every fire we light, every tool we shape, every bond we share. They live in the patience of endurance, the courage of curiosity, the strength of community. They are within us not only as ancestors, but as teachers, as reminders of what it means to be human. Imagine for a moment the last family of Homo erectus on Java. The fire flickers low, the night air hums with insects, the stars wheel silently above. They do not know that they are the last, that their kind's long story is closing. To them, life is simply life, gathering food, caring for children, watching the horizon for dawn. In their simplicity lies the deepest truth, that the essence of humanity is not in knowing the future, but in living the present, in enduring, in sharing, in persisting. That truth has not changed. It is as real for us now as it was for them then. The legacy of Homo erectus is not carved in monuments, not written in books, not painted on cave walls. It is carved in time itself, in the unbroken line from them to us. When we stand on the earth, we stand on their footsteps. When we look to the horizon, we follow their gaze. When we endure, when we adapt, when we seek the unknown, we continue their story. They were the first to rise tall and walk like us. They were the first to shape stone with thought, to guard fire with care, to venture beyond the familiar. They lasted longer than any of us have yet managed. Their name, Erectus, means upright, and upright they still stand in memory, pillars of the human journey. So let us honor them not as relics of the past, but as companions of the present, voices in the long chorus of humanity. They are not gone. They are with us always, in the enduring fire, in the crafted tool, in the steps we take across the earth. Theirs is a legacy of endurance, of courage, of continuity, and as long as we remember, as long as we walk, their story will never truly end. And so we come to the end of the long journey of Homo erectus. Across 2 million years they walked this earth, carrying fire in their hands and courage in their hearts. They were not just bones and tools left behind in the soil, they were people who lived, struggled, cared, and endured. Without them, we would not be here. Their story is not simply history, it is a reminder that humanity is built on resilience, curiosity, and the will to keep moving forward, no matter how harsh the world becomes. As you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you can imagine the glow of one of their fires flickering in the distance. Imagine their small groups gathered together under the stars, the same stars you see today, sharing warmth and safety in the darkness. Time has carried us far, but in that quiet moment, you are connected to them. Their breath, their footsteps, their courage still echo in you. So rest easy, knowing that you are part of a story that began long before your birth and will continue long after. May the endurance of Homo erectus remind you that you, too, can endure. May their fire guide you through your own nights. And as you drift into sleep, may you carry the comfort that you are never alone. You are part of the great human story, one flame in a line that has never gone out. Good night.